Welcome everyone to Politically High Tech with your host, Elias. I have a guest here who's going to take you to a journey of history. And don't treat this like it's a light-paced, happy-go-lucky kind of journey. I'm sure there are positive moments. Well, but I want to make sure that you have an open mind, especially in the historical context, and something that I've been recently getting good at, even with a bit of an empathetic context. Because this is a journey of struggles. And I already have an author here. Well, by profession, she's a biologist. So this is, I would say, just slightly out of the wheelhouse, just based on the concept. But since she has personal stake, because it has something to do with her family, she used her transferable skills of research, investigation, and even critical thinking, which those are transferable skills in biology and even history. I would say that if you disagree with that, then you need to go back to school if you want to be nice, okay? Transferable skills are very important. You'd be surprised how much you could do if you just use some transferable skills. Keeping yourself in that little box is not going to do much. But I'm not going to lecture you too long. So I have Vivien, is it Sieber? Sieber. Okay, C then Burr. Okay. All right, yep. So there you go. I already messed up right there. I should ask about that last name. I thought I got it right after listening to a couple of interviews. No, but that's okay. I am not editing that part out. That's for sure. Because I don't mind some authenticity. I want great. I don't want perfection, because people could take that as phony, and I have that same school of thought. So just like I said, she does biology, okay? But since that's something to do with her family, long story short, her peak, what piqued her interest is when she found a trove of documents, pictures, letters. Not sure they have audio recording, because that was a sort of a new technology, at least at that time. And we are talking a timeline of 1880 to 2020. But I'm just going to add present because of the arching theme of anti-Semitism. Sadly, it's strong today. It was pretty dormant. It was secondary, but now it's in the forefront again because of recent events. If you haven't been paying attention, the Israeli-Hamas conflict, that's what brought up these thoughts that one would hope will never come back. But it's back because before I even shut down on this, because we haven't dealt with the root causes of it. I'm just going to say it like that. So let me just give you a bit more a lengthy introduction, because she's going to have a very compelling story, and it's a lot to get to. I mean, it's really a lot. All right. And I don't want this just to be treated as just, okay, transaction 1, 2, 3, finish, done. No, this is an impactful story, and I think you need to pay attention. And if you haven't gotten a good history teacher, God willing, this podcast will this episode in particular will replace that, because me personally, I only could speak for me. This should not be happening again. Normally you get a little more jokey, smart aleck version of me, but you're going to get the more serious, analytical version of me, because this is serious stuff, and I'm not going to treat it as light. If I treat it as light, it's just truly disrespectful, and there's just no way around it. Okay, so she normally deals with genetics. Okay, that's very scientific, but the story is about her family a couple of generations back. Like I said, from 1880 to 2020. But for my little flair, I'm even adding to the present, because anti-Semitism has stuck its supremely ugly head again. Okay. And 1880s, what was going on? That was the ending days of the Ottoman Empire, and Austria was still had a monarchy, I believe. Yeah, it still had a monarchy, because a lot of that stuff started to change, and we all know the major changes of 1930s when Nazis became the dominant party of Germany, and I mean, there's a lot of events that anti-Semitism was at the forefront. Okay, this is not a made-up issue. This is not Jews playing a victim card. This is well documented. Before I keep going on, because this introduction's already long enough, I'm gonna let her start with the story, or just have her correct me, because I want to make sure what she's presenting is done correctly, is represented correctly. It's more important than my own little ego. It's all right, Vivien?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you. Yes. No, your introduction was lovely. I'm going to start with back in 1880, when under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Jews were not allowed to buy property or live in cities until the sort of 1870s. And my great-grandparents, it was actually turned out to be a really huge family. It was one of the things that I sort of discovered very early on in this quest, if you like, to find out what happened. Was, as a geneticist, I started building a family tree, and then discovered that there were millions of Tikkurs, and they lived in Czechoslovakia. In fact, they lived in Moravia, outside Brno, which was then the capital of Moravia. It's now the sort of second city in Czechoslovakia. And the whole area was textiles. It was known as the Manchester of the Habsburg Empire. They didn't make cheap things. They actually made very fine fabrics. Obviously, they were exported to Vienna, but also to Paris and London. Anyway, as soon as Jews were allowed to buy property, my great-great-grandfather and my great-great-uncle bought a shop in Boskovici, which was the ghetto where the family were allowed to live. But my great-great-grandfather moved into Brno. He bought a draper's shop in the Kraut Market, which was the main square. And there are videos from the early 1900s that show it was very bustling. And he obviously did well, because he ended up with 3 shops on different sides of the square. Obviously, if you've got a huge fabric industry, you've got, by then you've got factories manufacturing clothes and off-the-peg clothes. People made their own clothes and all their domestic furnishing. So drapers did well. Anyway, they had the shop with a big flat with sort of long, thin house with stories above the shop, and that's where the family lived. And they had children. They ended up with 5, and my grandmother was the youngest. Now, she was very small, very, very petite, very pretty, and very charming, and she had this huge personality. And I'm pretty sure she was a bit spoilt. She was certainly cared for by her elder sister Zelma. And like she did well at school, was bored by the shops, and made that disastrous mistake that very many pretty girls make of marrying the first man who asked her, married, went to Vienna. That must have been part of the attraction of the wedding. It was a disaster. He was in his 30s. He came from a very observant Jewish family, where they weren't Jewish, but they weren't particularly observant. But he'd gone off the rails. He'd rebelled against his family and lived a very dissolute life in Vienna with pretty girls and clothes. Grandmother Paula got pregnant very quickly and was terribly unhappy because she was abandoned in a flat. And then along comes the baby, and she's left with this baby, and discovers that her husband is unfaithful. And in fact, her doctor said, she should abstain from relations because she'd got venereal disease. And so she grabbed the baby, got on a train, went back to her parents. And she sat around in Brno for a few years. And I think she was probably very bored by a clinging toddler. And this is the bit of the story that none of us can understand. She persuaded the family, who we've established are drapers in Brno, that what they really needed was a cinema in Vienna. And so they sold one of the shops and bought a cinema. And it was the Palace Kino on Josefstadterstrasse. And Paula and her older sister Zelma moved to Vienna to run the cinema, and it was run by the 2 women. It was a family venture. Her brother was an architect, and he redesigned the balcony to get extra seats in. And they worked hard, lived happily. And my grandmother met my grandfather, and this time it was a proper, true relationship. They met as adults. He was a rising lawyer and significantly older than her. They married, and my dad came along. And she went on working in the cinema. He went on building his law practice. And he qualified, and then he served in the First World War and got medals for gallantry, which was a bit unusual for a Jew in those days. And after the war, this is the First World War, so in 1918, he'd returned to Vienna and had to build a practice. Rents were controlled, and so he'd rented an incredibly palatial apartment which overlooks the Ringstrasse. Now, the Ringstrasse is one of the big roads that Franz Joseph had put in. It's got the Grand Palais and the Opera House, and the flats, my grandmother's flats, overlooks the university and the Ring. So Herman, my grandfather, used the flat as his practice, and this smart address probably attracted clients. Grandmother comes along, and they simply move into the flats. He then rents a room in an adjoining flat, makes a hole through the wall, and moves his practice into that. And the family live in the rest of the flats. Everything's going really well. They're having a wonderful 1930s, late 20s, glittering lifestyle. She opens one of the Vienna balls, and there are these amazing photographs of her dressed up in evening gowns with lots of feathers and sequins. And then tragically, my grandfather was hit by a drunken taxi driver and died slowly and painfully of gangrene. His leg was broken. They put it in a cast. He got gangrene, and antibiotics hadn't been invented. I can remember my dad saying that he got taken to see his father. He was only 5.5. And every time he went to see him, another bit had been amputated. So they were trying to stem the gangrene and failed. And so he died after 3.5 rather agonizing months, leaving Paula a widow with her 2 sons to care for. So she went on working in the cinema, and the boys went to school. And one thing that happened was there was compensation was paid to my dad, to Peter, for the car accident. And so he received payments for the entire time. He was to receive money while he was still in education. Paula took none because she had an income from the cinema. And conditions began to deteriorate because Hitler had taken over in Germany. And although Austria is a separate country, the Versailles Treaty, which was what the Allies agreed at the end of the First World War, and it specifically forbade Germany from annexing Austria. But anti-Semitism, the effects of anti-Semitism did seep across the border. One example was that Austria actually had a film industry, and the Germans said, well, we won't buy any film that's had anybody Jewish employed in making it. So a lot of Jewish actors obviously emigrated. Some went to the States or England, others went to Europe. But the cinema industry uses a lot more than just actors. There would have been all the technicians and film crew. They were tended to be very big films with lots and lots of sets, so the set makers. Grandmother's role in the cinema was to choose the films, and she was very much the public face, greeting the audience. So she knew a lot of people in the cinema industry, and she was obviously very good at choosing films people wanted to see. Because although Josefstadtstrasse isn't right in the centre of town, the Palace Kino became quite a respected cinema and often got films early. And of course, until 1930, the films were silent. So she would work with the pianist to choose the music, because there were lots and lots of little films rather than one long feature film. And they also had a stage, so there was a bit of vaudeville and things like that. But anyway, so conditions deteriorate, and particularly for Jews. And then you've got the Anschluss. Now, the Anschluss was where Hitler simply marched across the border. And this film showing how he was greeted very, very enthusiastically by a lot of Austrians. And they march across Austria straight into Vienna. And one of the things that Hitler did very well was he was very good at staging things. And some of the early sort of cinematographic, large-scale stage things, if you look at the videos or the film of Hitler coming into Vienna or anywhere else, it's staged. It really makes an impact. No, I said at the outset that my grandmother's flat overlooked the Ringstrasse. Well, my dad left a description of him and his mother and the maid Zeffi hidden behind the windows in this flat, overlooking the Ringstrasse and actually watching this triumphal parade. The goose stepping, they must have been completely terrifying. The goose stepping, booted soldiers, and then this car with a little brown man and, the Sieg Heil. But probably more frightening was the crowds went mad. And there is a quote from the French ambassador saying the only damage that any of the Germans came to was if they were scratched by thorns from the roses that the populace threw at them. So my grandmother realised that it simply wasn't safe and that she had to send her son to safety. Now, as it happened, my half-uncle, Peter's half-brother, was already in London. He had married his childhood sweetheart and got a job in London, working as a rep for an Austrian engineering firm. And so they had a flat in Streatham, which was then new. It was built in the 30s. These flats a lot of them were occupied by immigrants. And, Eric had been writing saying, oh, well, it wasn't quite London and it wasn't quite the country, but it was lovely. And the streets weren't quite paved with gold, but they were doing really well. So she sent Peter out. Now, to do that, she had to prove that he paid all his taxes. She had to pay the exit taxes. Now, fortunately, the money was available because she could use the compensation paid for my grandfather. And he was 17 in 2 weeks, and she sent him across Europe on his own on a train, which, again, must have been really frightening. He describes his journey, and he described the relief of going into Switzerland and the change in accent. And then whenever I was a child, whenever we went across the English Channel, we went to France, we come back and we get, he'd go, oh, and when he saw the white cliffs of Dover, he realised he was safe and he'd come to freedom. But of course, he arrived in Streatham and his half-brother actually was unemployed because the Nazis had taken over the factory and were making armaments. So they didn't really need a rep at all. So he and his wife were scratching around with what they could get. Meanwhile, back in Vienna, my grandmother realizes she needs to escape. Now, it's much harder for her because the papers from the archives show just how quickly the Nazis confiscated the cinema. That happened within weeks of the Anschluss. Paula had no money other than the income from the cinema, which was already massively reduced because they put in a manager and were now paying her, my grandmother and her sister, less than they needed to pay the staff. My grandmother, my great aunt Zelma wasn't in any position to leave because her husband had just died and she was in pieces. So she wanted to stay where everything was familiar. So there were no real assets for my grandmother. She needed to leave what she could because Zelma would need it to live off. The flat was rented. It may have been palatial, but it was rented. Every other Jew in Vienna was trying to sell their posh furniture. And in the end, she appealed to a former lover, which must have been really difficult for such an independent woman. And he sent the money. She went through this round of humiliation of having to show that she paid all the taxes. Every time the cinema was valued, it was valued at less. And you had to get loads of stamps. You had to go to consulates to get, permit to pass through Switzerland, permit to come into Britain. Eric had sent an affidavit. You couldn't just come to Britain. You had to have someone who would say that they would vouch for you and you would not cost the state anything. So just as he'd sent one for his half-brother, he sent one for Paula. So she had to go around this round and round of getting permits, and then she was allowed to leave with one suitcase and about £10 and made the journey across Europe, arriving in Streatham to a rather full flat because it was a smallish flat and it already had Peter in it. And she needed a job. So first of all, she spoke no English at all. She was 54, and she went when she first got there. She went to the public library every day and learnt 10 words a day, and her sons would test her. And it is remarkable that within 6 months she was writing to my dad in really good English, because I've got those letters. Anyway, she gets a job as the assistant matron in a hostel for girls who were saved on the kinder transport in Tynemouth. Now, Tynemouth is just outside Newcastle. It's on the coast. And basically, when you've got the Anschluss, and then a few months later, you have Kristallnacht, which it's now known as the November pogrom, or the Night of Broken Glass. Now, the Nazis just raged across Germany, Austria, and German-occupied lands, smashing the glass in Jewish shops, synagogues, looting, beating up, killing, arresting. It was an orchestrated riot, essentially. And Kristallnacht was very influential because it got publicity both in England and America. The newspapers picked it up. Now, in England, it resulted in a sort of recognition that things really were bad, and we must do something to save the children. So there were speeches in Parliament, there were things on the radio, on the Home Service, appealing for people to take the children either in hostels or to take them in family homes. And I mean, this was all assumed to be temporary. So a group in Newcastle, they were friends there are no minutes and no papers or anything, but they formed an ad hoc committee and decided that what they'd do is they set up a hostel. They decided you couldn't mix boys and girls in the 30s, so they decided girls were more vulnerable. And they got this big house in Tynemouth. It's lovely. It actually overlooks the sea. And they recruited a matron. They went via Woburn House, which was a sort of clearing station in London for refugees. I mean, it was run by Quakers and Jews. It wasn't just Jews. The Quakers did a lot, as they did with the kinder transport. Anyway, so Woburn House recommended Alice Erbach, who was a famous cook in Vienna. And Alice and Paula were friends. They were both widowed, both had sons, and so they were friends in Vienna. So when they needed a second matron, Alice recommended Paula. And so Paula becomes the second matron in this hostel. Now, everything in the hostel was donated by the community. And the Northeast has always been a rather poor community, particularly as the industry stopped. It was already stopping in the 30s. You had the famous Yarrow marches when unemployed men marched to London to make that, to show that their poverty. And yet these communities were incredibly generous, and they provided everything, food, furniture, fuel. And they had to pay £50 per child to guarantee their return. They had to pay for medicine because the NHS hadn't been founded. And the kinder transport scheme was one where parents, or quite often actually, talking to the girls, it wasn't parents, it would have been another relative, because you don't want people being upset at stations. Basically, children were collected at mainline stations and escorted by strangers across Europe. And this is where the children have the famous luggage labels put around their necks to identify them. And people on the ground, again, a lot of Quakers and some Jews, identified children perhaps because they were orphaned or their parents had been arrested or there was no money. And the children were shipped via Holland across the sea to Britain, not knowing where they were going or who they were going to end up with. And the girls that ended up in Tynemouth, some went direct via Liverpool Street, which is a mainline train station, because they didn't know what Liverpool Street was and thought they were ending up in Liverpool. And if there was someone to escort them, good. If they were really tiny. But some of them were, 13 and 14, and they were just put on a train. They didn't speak English. So they, wouldn't, told, you get off at Newcastle, but they wouldn't know what Newcastle was. They seem to have been treated with great kindness by strangers, but it's an appalling position to be in. Only once they get to Newcastle, they don't know, that they've ended up in the hostel, but they have. And this is where I was really lucky in the story, in that many of them stayed in touch with my grandmother throughout her life. And my dad did this survey of them in 1999-2000, asking what they'd done with their lives, what qualifications they'd got, what family they got. And they then wrote really movingly about the experience. And some have been really generous and let me go and talk to them. And some still talk to me, quite regularly. And so what they describe is leaving, loving families and ending up in a hostel where, however kind, you've got these two women who are refugees, have got 25 or 30 children to care for. There's no staff, so they absolutely have to do everything. It's open fires, no central heating. It would have been pretty cold. They have to do the cleaning. They have to do the do the cooking. That must have been a really difficult thing to adjust to. And it does seem that the older children found it harder to adjust than the younger ones. The youngest child, Inga, was 5.5 when she arrived. She's now 90 and living in Wimbledon, which is South London. And she can't really remember. She said she can't remember anything about the first hostel, and she can't really remember her family life. But she has got this heartrending photograph of her and her older sister, they arrived in Liverpool Street together, and a baby sister who was too young to travel, who died with her mother. Anyway, so basically grandmother gets on with it and does the best she can. Then, of course, war is declared. Now, the local papers were very interested in the setting up of the hostel, and they interviewed the matrons, and they interviewed some of the girls. And what does seem extraordinary is the way the schools cope with a sudden influx of 25 or 30 children who don't speak English. Most of the girls were Austrian or German, except Dasha, who was Czech. Now, she spoke neither English nor German and was in the awful position of not being able to communicate, really. My grandmother may have been Czech, but she didn't really speak very much Czech. She spoke German. Anyway, so the headmaster simply took these children, divided up his ordinary class, and put one of the refugee girls with a little group of natives and made them do it all in English. And they seem to have learnt incredibly quickly, which was good. The occupants, the natives in Tynemouth, are very generous and hospitable. My grandmother negotiated free trips to the cinema once a week so that they could improve their English, and they had free use of the outside pool. But of course, once war breaks out, conditions change. They become enemy aliens overnight. Now, that means that my grandmother, Mrs. Erbach, and my father are enemy aliens because they're over 16. And the girls are told, oh, you mustn't speak German outside the house because you're enemy aliens. And as one of them, Annie, said, well, it was pretty obvious we weren't British from our accents and our grammar. But things continue, they deteriorate. One of the things, of course, that happens is that until then, the girls have been getting letters from their parents. And one of the things that I learnt from Elfie, one of the girls, is how important the street photographers were. Because for pennies, they could have photographs taken, which they would send back to their parents to show they were okay. Of course, that all stopped as soon as the war started. Things toddle on. But of course, the Germans did this amazing blitzkrieg where they simply marched north across Europe. They went through Holland, across France, and essentially pushed the British army off the edge at Dunkirk. Now, Dunkirk is, in British terms, terribly famous because it's when all the little boats went and rescued the land forces. It's also the time when the Germans started heavy bombing on coastal places. So they're doing heavy bombing in London, but of course they're bombing Newcastle by now in Tynemouth. And what happened was, first of all male enemy aliens were interned. So my dad was collected. He was by then a student at Newcastle University. He was simply collected by the police and taken off, first to the Isle of Man, and then sent to Canada. And then they recognised it was a mistake sending refugees out with Nazis on the same boat. That's not a really good idea. And then they freed Peter was freed very soon after he got to Canada, but there was no boat to bring him back. And he comes back and goes back to being a student. What they did to the hostel was they said, well, you've got 3 weeks to move. You can't stay here. It's a defence zone and you might be bombed. And the girls wrote about being taken down to air raid shelters, having to use gas masks. There'd been an outbreak of the diphtheria, so many of them had ended up in hospital and coming out of hospital. One poor girl got measles and diphtheria. Anyway, and this is a bit that, again, it's very difficult to find out quite how they managed it, but they moved furniture, 25 to 30 girls and the matrons, from Tynemouth to Windermere, to a lovely house. Windermere, if you're not used to English geography, is in the very beautiful Lake District. So Windermere is a lake, but there's a small town near it, Bowness on Windermere. And it had a very small school, which was already full of evacuated children from Newcastle because they'd moved the young population out to avoid bombing. Yet they managed to assimilate these children and treat them with enormous generosity. The teachers would teach after hours to coach individual girls, which is quite astounding. And so they spent the rest of the war there. Rationing happened. People brought local produce, which was very, and were generous and kind to them. I think that was clear. The girls' reactions were quite mixed. So some absolutely loved the freedom and the beauty of the countryside. Annie wrote very movingly about not particularly daffodils, which is the Wordsworth poem, but bluebells and rhododendrons. And of course, they were sent out foraging. They had to collect firewood and blackberries and fruit and stuff. Now, some of them loved that freedom. And some of them said, no, we hated it. It was cold and we got our fingers prickled. And Dasha said very intelligently, and of course, we didn't realise that what had been a hostel was turning into an orphanage. Because when the war ended, very few of their parents had survived. And it then there's something that took me by surprise was how long it took to sort everything out. You think war ends, new life starts. Well, actually, war ends, Europe is in chaos. You've lost your infrastructure. People are spread all over the place. Some are in camps, some are dead. One girl's mother survived and was sent to Sweden. And it's then 18 months before she's well enough to travel to come to England and where her daughter and her husband are. Because we didn't have the sort of medicine we have. Treating people who have been starved is very slow. Now, my dad, by then, he graduated, joined the Royal Navy, which he was the first enemy alien to serve in the Navy, and he was in minesweeping. But they very rapidly moved him to naval intelligence. And so he spent the end of the war and that time after the war in North Europe doing whatever the Admiralty asked him to do, which was generally finding out Germans who developed technology, because their technology was very good. So he would find them, and then people who had better technology than my dad would talk about what they'd actually done. But he asked the Admiralty if there was any chance for him to go to Vienna. He'd like to go. And they kindly sent him. And this is where he discovered that virtually none of the family had survived. None of them had a good they all had good reasons for not leaving. Zelma was widowed. My grandmother's sister-in-law was a widow, but she had a very disabled child. And they didn't think that Fritz would survive travel. His brother escaped to Israel on one of the illegal boats. So just as we have boats now coming across from Africa illegally, making that terrible journey, then it was going the other way. And it was just as dangerous because it was Palestine and it was being run by the British. and they wouldn't let people out, so you had to go in on a little boat. I mean, so France made it to Israel. My two great uncles were both died in camps. One was married to a Catholic, so he assumed he'd be safe. So he lived in hiding, and I'm not clear whether it was Brno or Prague or both. I think it was probably both. And his wife, Mishi, worked and brought in the income, but she got sick and died, and so he lost his protection and went to Auschwitz. The other one died before he got to Auschwitz, but he died in the Vienna ghetto. And the more and more, the further I look, obviously I did a family tree, the further I look in the tree, terribly more people die. So the sister-in-law with the disabled child was collected on one of the very, very first transports. And although the documentation is astoundingly detailed, I can't trace him. So I think he probably died on the first set of cattle trucks. His mother died in Mali-Trostenetz, which is one of the killing centres in the east. And you can trace, I've traced when she was collected, which transport she was on. So she was very early in that one. My grandmother's niece, Fritzi, survived, and actually I met her in the late 80s. She survived Theresienstadt, which was pretty unusual, and eventually made it back to Brno. And her husband had also survived in a different camp, but I haven't worked out which one. And so they had to rebuild their lives from scratch. She couldn't have children after what had happened in the camp. But when I met her, she was an astounding little lady. And the hostel sort of starts winding up in 1946, and my grandmother then was stateless because she'd lost her Austrian nationality and hadn't got British nationality. So my dad found someone. The cinema was very dilapidated, and it had operated throughout the war. And the lady who'd run the sweetie kiosk, of course, she remembered him as a little boy, not as a young man in British naval uniform, but she told him the story of what had happened to the family. And he found someone who could, the managers, the Nazi managers had essentially ran away. And so Peter found someone, a very distant family member, to run the cinema. And I've got correspondence between my grandmother and this woman. And clearly grandmother was telling her how to run the cinema by post until she could get to Vienna. And she got naturalized British, could travel, and was terribly distressed when she got there because it was dilapidated. And it had changed its name. It was no longer the Palace Kino, but it was the Palace Lichtspiele. Now, it turns out Hitler didn't like the word Kino because it's Greek. And so all cinemas have become Lichtspieles. And there's then a battle for grandmother to get the cinema reinstated to her. And it's been operating with no investment at all. And then, ironically, the American army commandeers it for performances. Don't pay. And so they're using it like 3 or 4 showings a day. And there's only 1 showing a day that's bringing in paying customers. And then the next thing that happens is that France, the nephew who's gone to Israel, made a counterclaim for the cinema, and we can't completely find out what happened there. The papers say that it goes to court, and we've got the papers that say this needs to go to a higher court, but we can't find the papers that say what actually happened at the higher court. What I do know is it then got sold, and France is one of the new purchasers. And that my grandmother always felt she didn't get what she deserved for the cinema. Now, she needed that money because she needed it to live off. Because by then she's in her 60s and she's worked very hard throughout her life. And she needs income. So there was this great family feud that we can't quite understand. And she retired. She after the hostel closed, she became a landlady in the northeast. She bought a little house. And is cooking breakfast for her male visit, her gentleman. But then she moved to London to be with her sons. And what was really nice is that the girls from the hostel kept in touch with her throughout her life, really.
All right. I hope you really paid attention to this because, like I said, it's going to be compelling. It was a lot. This was very material heavy, and rightfully so for this case. Normally, super material heavy stuff could be convoluted, mess. This one's quite different. It's different because it's a compelling story with different stakes. I mean, there's so many themes I could put on that. Resourcefulness is a big one. You had to adapt for such multiple adversarial situations, especially your grandmother. Shit, if they return to a movie, I won't be surprised one of the main characters would be your grandmother because she did a lot, and she was an advanced age when she mastered English. You don't hear most 50-year-olds picking up a very different language that quickly these days. I normally hear people say, "Oh, it took me a year or even 5 years just to really learn a language." And I'm not trying to be facetious or mean about it, but that's what I normally hear when it comes to picking up a new language. So there was culture shock, definitely, and we could correct if I'm wrong. I think it jumped from Czech Republic to Austria/Hungary Empire, which rightly pointed out, because that's how it was set up at that time. To Britain and all the other, and then it got pretty scattered. He said a little bit of Israel, and of course, your father was shipped to Canada. I mean, it's a compelling story, but I think if it's going to be told in a movie, it might have to be a duology or maybe a trilogy. I don't know. I'm not a movie buff, but I could easily see it being done that way. So that's why I see, or even a migrant story, another big one, because your migration happened multiple times.
Well, and the girls on the kinder have now spread across the world. So one stayed like 20 miles from Windermere, others ended up in Australia, quite a few in America. One married a GI and went to the States, others ended up in the States, and several went to Israel.
Yeah, so
one thing that's nice is they stayed in touch with one another very much, and they had this reunion in the 80s in London. But they seem to have intuitively understood and supported each other. They seem to be very sensitive to each other's needs. What the matrons did, because they couldn't, obviously there's too much work for two people to look after everyone, they divided the children up into little, middle and large. So large looked after middle, middle looked after little. And there are lots of sort of anecdotes or writing about, how they did something, how one cared for another. And they do seem to, that bond seems to have carried on, which is nice.
Oh yeah, that's another thing. Another thing I was thinking of. Community, regardless of distance. Which that's because especially when when that whole hostel and orphanage if I come up with a nice way of saying it, scramble happened. That's one for your community too. And this is pre-social media, people. This is pre-social media. I have to emphasize that. There's such thing as letters and photos, those things exist at that time. Even though I am a millennial myself, but since I have a pretty good understanding of times and maintaining mostly pure context of things, this is before the Facebook and all of that. I'm sure they could have done it a lot more efficient if social media happened that time, but it didn't. Social media is more of a 1990s technology. Yeah. It was that early, but it was very small. It was small scale. It was tested through only military and then expanded universities, and eventually it was commercialized for massive use that we experience today. So that's, I know some people, the younger generation, the Gen Z, is like, how are they able to do this? Well, I just gave an idea. Okay, letters, photos you could still mail. And people were resourceful back then without social media. So
it might be worth explaining that the photographs were paper prints. I gave a talk at school, and the children just didn't know what a print was. How did you get the photographs? They did. It wasn't done on mobile phones. It was done on cameras, big film celluloid.
Oh yeah, and in the process, those photos and papers. I mean, that was a very long process into itself. It wasn't just or even just mobile phones, like you said, just send it instantaneously. No, these were very slow, thorough, complicated processes back then. You can't just you can't just use a smartphone, just take a picture. Oh, look at this shooting right here, and just send it instantaneously. No, these circulations took time compared to today. So that's another thing we need to understand. Is just, of course, I'm talking to more of the younger listeners, pre-millennial generations. Y'all understand this. I don't have to break this down. I know I'm kind of discriminating by age, but there's some technological understandings that my point is, we're all a product of our own time. We were shaped by what was born when we became an adult, of what technologies were available at that time. That's my point. It's not to spread ageism. It's just, are there people who are 80 years old who could use a smartphone? Yeah, of course. Are there certain young people that use old technology? Yeah, if you put your mind into it, if you dedicate. So I'm not spreading ageism, and I am going to stop defending myself right there. But just have understanding about how things were done back then. That's the main takeaway I want you to have, listeners. My old audience, you know what this is. You can just ignore this part. You know how it's done. I don't have to break this down to you unless you want to know the more advanced kinks of it. And don't come to me for that. I'm sure there are people who are more qualified than me just to explain that kind of stuff. I know where my lane is, and it's not getting to how old photos were done back then. I could just give you just a general premise, and that's it. The advanced technical knowledge, no, don't come to me for that. I'm just gonna go, I don't know what the hell that is done. Yeah. So much wonderful themes. Let's get back to your story now before I derail this. Because, well, not just your story, your family story, and it's very, very compelling. I hope you pick something up how you could transfer to your family. That community is very important. Being resourceful is very important, because there's people, as migrants coming to the country, are dealing with, a new language, and some are not learning it as quick. And, even those who learn it, they pick up the accent, and that's some of that xenophobia and discrimination as occurs. Okay, this one speaks English a little broken. That one's not that bright. These backward people, And not saying it like that, but they're getting treated a bit differently. You got to pay attention more to the undertones, how people are separated, what their demeanor, body language, use things like that just to detect the more subtle.
I think there were a lot of the children talked about actually very small differences that would have been, and not trivial. In Germany, they didn't play team sports, so they hadn't played any of the ball games that you play when you're at school in Britain. That was completely new. That they were used to skiing and hiking and things like that. Well, actually, we don't really have skiing because we don't get snow like that. The food was completely different. The smell was completely different. We didn't have. Britain then didn't really have coffee. So they'd. Several of them talked about milk in tea, because we put milk in tea, but that you didn't. I mean, my grandmother always tried to be very British, and my dad used to tease her chronically because her Britishness was always she'd put the tea in and then the milk. She'd never get that right, and of course she'd got a very sweet tooth, so she couldn't stand marmalade, and it was always something in jam, which is not necessarily very British. How British she wanted to be, it didn't always work.
Yeah. Well, regardless, I'm giving her a pass about how resourceful she's been. I mean, she's been through a lot. So, I mean, just me being a giving personal opinion, I would give her a pass. Let her create her own Britishness with all the stuff she went through. Maybe, ironically, people who don't sometimes do things correct culturally end up changing things. So she was kind of like an innovator in some kind of sense. I don't know if you agree with that, but she was very resourceful. I mean, she worked as a young woman, and sadly, a lot of feminists don't understand. You just think old women who just sit home and cook cook and just take care of their children. That was not always the case. Even people 1900s, even go to World War II, a lot of women had to work because the men were shipped out. That's the American context, but women did work back then. There were women that were singers, and of course, sadly, the housemaid and in mansions, which is not the best example of promoting women liberation. I'm just gonna say like that. But women did work back then. And feminists, I got to get educated because some of the stuff you be saying are just not true and it's overly simplified. If I'm going to be kind about it, normally I could just be nasty, just throw a lot of insults, but that'll just create more conflict than I care to engage in. So you got to make these connections, and you just realize, open your eyes. Some things were the same in the past, and some things were obviously different, and we tend to pay attention to differences, especially when it comes to history. We don't make some of that same connection about how human community is still very important. Well, today too, even though we are so distracted with the whole social media, smartphones, Netflix, what have you, and Netflix didn't exist back then. So cinema wasn't just in your home, going through a bunch of shows and channels and all that. Yeah, cinema was pretty different back then. But I like to do my own digging and research before I can just compare the compelling difference between today's film industry to back then. And those refugees who escaped from there during, especially the World War II, they made Hollywood happen in America. That's a connection, with these cameras I got, these are the cameras probably more. I'm not even sure these are the right ones. I was trying to find a very good Austrian film thing, but it was harder than it seems. So if I have such a tone deaf background, I got a little bit of explanation. This is the best thing I could find. And just to put it nicely, Vivien's story has so many layers, it's hard to capture it in one picture unless you want to get the cover of her book. That gives you that probably just give you just a taste right there. There you go. Plug it in. Kinder and kinda. And
cinema, kinder, children as in kinder transport.
So that influenced the title right there. That definitely answers that question, how you came up with that. And we already went through the whole family history, how it's relevant to World War I and II. So that really answers that question. I don't like to be repetitive. So now this is more of a guiding question. What takeaways you want the readers to get? I mean, how should the readers this is a probably bad word, consume your book?
Well, I took the story right up to, from my grandmother's death, right up to me getting Austrian citizenship, because the Austrians kindly offered victims of National Socialism back citizenship. Obviously, it was lost when my grandmother and my father came to England. And one of the things that's been very interesting was that Austria started the story by saying, "Oh, well, we were invaded by the Nazis. It wasn't really our fault." And though the film shows quite clearly that they were really pleased to be invaded, or many of them were. And there has, over the last 25, perhaps 30 years, been a complete change in the attitude in Austria, that they recognise that bad things were done, that terrible things were done. And they're trying to, by recognising it, there's this amazing wall with all the names of people who were killed, Austrians who were killed by the Nazis. And yes, quite a few of my family members are on the wall. I think one of the things we want to do, I brought that up today, and I talked about meeting Fritzi and what it was like under the communist regime, because that wasn't good either. But one of the reasons for telling the story is we don't want it to happen again. And it's very clear that actually things happened over a sort of 10, 15-year period. You've got, which isn't very long really, but you've got a gradual deterioration and loss of freedom. And you ultimately, you've got this totalitarian state and genocide. Now, what we're seeing at the moment, which is very frightening, are political lurchers mostly to the right, and to these huge populist leaders. You've had Trump, we've had Johnson, and our current Conservative government is now trying to remake laws. Now, once you lose the judiciary and you lose political freedom, you are on the slippery slope to something that is truly terrible and truly frightening. And so that's something I think, we know freedom is fragile and we have to learn to preserve it. So that's why I've told the story in some ways. I just don't want it to happen again. And tragically, we're beginning to see it happen all over the place.
I mean, me as a researcher, that was the first thing I took away. This is more how not to. We don't want this thing. We don't want this anti-Semitism, even communism, that whatever the word we're going to use, fascism, ultra nationalism, what have you. All these words, because leaders love to do wordplay. They like to call it something else, but it's really something more insidious than what the word is really suggesting. Yeah, I mean, I could talk about, sadly, Trump for a while, but me and my listeners are tired of talking about him. He's always in the news for mostly the wrong reasons. Not a big fan of him. Actually, I'm not even a big fan of either party, but that's a whole other beast for another day. But to your point, this is why the price of freedom is vigilance. Once you're no longer vigilant, like you said, it's fragile, it will go away pretty quickly. You already said 10, 15 years. I think that's the right estimation of freedom just being taken away just like that. And that's why the price for freedom is always internal vigilance. Because once you start losing that vigilance, and once whoever's in charge, who got nefarious means, and knows that, they're going to just peel rights away. If they're smart, they do a little by little until you realize that, oh, what just happened? How we got there? Well,
and the other thing is that you've got to have sort of true equality. You can pick off Jews or you can pick off Sinti. It wasn't just we know 60 million Jews were killed in the war by the Nazis, but there was also the disabled, homosexuals, communists, Sinti, Roma, other sort of gypsies. Now, your freedom of an individual is only as good as the freedom of the whatever minority group it is. And you've seen genocide roughly throughout my life, whether it was Cambodia or some of the more recent ones, like the Rohingya, and that is terrifying.
I think I can ask Rwanda as well in Africa. That's a pretty recent one. That happened, I think, in the early 90s. Yeah. And these things, they pop up at different countries, different times, but it's generally the same thing. And I mean, there's even wars happening in multiple African nations right now, and I'm actually more happy about the ones that they're uniting, pushing back against colonialism.
Yeah, I mean, Rwanda had genocide. Now, the thing is that until you've got freedom for every individual, you once you've got one, you start losing freedom for a group for whatever reason, then you're going down the slippery slope to genocide.
Oh, absolutely. And I like how you just broke that down, because you already broke it down to the sign. The very first sign is, we are heading into this genocidal trap. Sadly, a good chunk of Americans, we just wait for something real big to happen, and then we react. Sometimes it's even too late. I start trying to push the alarm as early as I can. I don't care if I seem like an alarmist or even at times a conspiracy theorist. I said, no, I go by the historical perspective. Call me a conspiracy theorist all you want, but if I got evidence, at least indirect and circumstantial evidence for my reasons, if you want to keep calling me that, that's fine. You're just being dismissive, and you want to be the cycle of ignorance or hate that just perpetuates them again. And now to this example, the more current example is the Israeli-Hamas conflict. And of course, anti-Semitism is just spewing all over the place globally. I already got a couple examples, and one example, Michigan. A few of them was just violent. I mean, even before this conflict, there was already a couple of them happening in New York. And New York City is a very diverse place, but there's still certain bad actors in there who just are moved by hate. And once they see that once they see something that justifies or confirms their hate, they're gonna take action. Because in their crazy mind, they think they're right for whatever reason. I mean, but someone of sane mind could just see that that person is not right. And I'll be going back to that. And it was even, I mean, there's a lot of the hate going on, but for the purpose of this, we're focusing on anti-Semitism. But to your point, there are other hates that are going on. I think Asian hate went on the rise. I'm told locally in New York City, there was already a couple of attacks on that. Those group of individuals, just to talk about minorities dealing with hate besides, just the anti-Semitism scope. And of course, anti-Islamic, couple of Palestinians were killed as well. So that's another thing that's going on. Just because of people moved by hate, and once they see the news coverage, oh, you see what these barbarians did? They behead, they do all that, so I'm going to just kill one of them. And it was a kid, a 6-year-old boy, just happened to have Palestinian. I was like, come on, you think a 6-year-old boy that's a Palestinian American is going to really absorb all that, even fully understand that? That's just crazy. But hate is coming back. I think that's one of the main reasons why you wrote that. Besides, even though the main theme in that one is anti-Semitism, but just like to your intelligent point, it could be applied to other groups, minorities, oppressed, disadvantaged.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's just a broad enough. So that's actually brilliant. So I mean, your opinion, why do you really think anti-Semitism is just rising again, besides of ignorance or even hate I mentioned?
I think you've also got social media, and you're getting these very big swings possibly on complete misinformation. Anti-Semitism isn't new; it's gone on for a couple of thousand years. You've got the examples of you can't buy property, which is where we started the story. But now it takes very, very little. You see sort of great. I don't do social media in that way. I do use social media, but you see something, and it just explodes on X, formerly known as Twitter, or I think in TikTok as well, and it's a sort of mass bandwagon that things sort of grow.
Oh no, absolutely.
That's an additional danger.
And that's a danger that definitely did not exist for, I'll say, most of the story that Vivien just told us. I was like, yeah, that was, I mean, propaganda did happen more through newspapers and cameras and stuff. They did exist at that time. It was definitely slower than today. It's very true. Instant viral moments, and sadly, the hateful and stuff that contains that's laced with misinformation. Yeah, I'm treating it like a drug. I'm using the word laced. People just get hooked. Millions instantaneously, just like that. I was, oh yeah, the Jews are bad, the Palestinians are bad, yeah. And people just reacting based just purely out of emotion, not even thinking, not even taking a step back to see is this video accurate? Does this video provide any real value? Nope. React.
It's quite
react. They just.
This goes back to the importance of information literacy. That it's actually quite easy to create something that looks quite convincing, and yet when you interrogate it's bullshit. And I think that's something that we really, really need to teach, preferably from childhood. But you've got to teach. You teach undergraduates to be critical. That's part of doing a degree. And I think we have to teach them, to be critical about the information they're using. Now, we would teach them that. We teach them that automatically when we're teaching a discipline. We need to teach them that you apply that across everything. And I think we are badly served, certainly in Britain, by our press. We have quite polarized newspapers, and most people will only read the newspaper that suits their politics, rather than reading lots of different newspapers where I mean, some of them are quite extraordinary from my perspective. And I know we've had COVID, and we had all this. Oh, we mustn't listen to experts. But actually, what is the point of not listening to the scientists? Because they probably know more than people who've got no training or no expertise in that area, and that certainly here that led to excess deaths.
Oh, I'm happy you brought that up because that was one of my fear was not the virus itself. It was the polarization. I already know how the media was already were. And yeah, they have the MSNBC, well, for America, MSNBC, the CNN, the left leaning people will pay attention to that. And Newsmax and Fox, more right wing people will pay attention to that. The center, I'm more of a centrist independent. We have, News Nation was just starting up and they were starting to get some traction. That's more the centrist. They try to provide both perspectives if they can. Sometimes they do a good job. Sometimes I think they could polish up a bit. And then the Hill was the more established centered wing on publication. But even they didn't do such a good job because they were more into the drama than the policy because they want clicks and views. And that's
but the BBC has this idea that you have to have somebody expressing the other view. So you get somebody, you get, when it was Brexit was a really good example where you would get someone relatively sensible standing up and saying, it's not going to be good for the economy. And then you get, some guy who goes, oh, no, it's wonderful. All the foreigners are horrible. And we had that with COVID to a smaller extent. And that's, in some ways, yes, you can provide evidence, but the evidence has got to be sort of equally valid, not just, some rabid right-wing person saying, no, we don't need to wear masks. Masks infringe our personal liberty. Well, yes, they do, but there are reasons why you might wish to take that decision.
Yeah, I mean, that one I had a hard time even navigating because even though I understand, we got to be safe, protect our fellow human beings. I get that. That's why I only went out only when I really need to. So that, and sadly, I still got the virus if I was being cautious. But I'm not saying throw caution to the wind. No. I'm more of try to find a smart, scientific, or true, or the best way possible just to mitigate the spread because this virus is very tricky. Even if you was cautious, a good chunk of those people still got it. Even they did the mask and all of that other stuff. I mean, some people overly masked to the point that I thought was ridiculous, like being car alone, everything covered, and you went to say, no, I'm going to say if you have air coming in, then you wear the mask.
No, that's one of the things that we have to remember is that with hindsight, we didn't know when the virus hit that it was airborne. So we were all frantically washing our hands and doing things like that, which is not a bad thing to do. But in fact, if it's an airborne virus, you want to protect yourself from the aerosol. And so the advice changed the scientists changed their advice as more information came along. All right, I think many people don't realise, or maybe they do now, maybe COVID's been good for that it isn't written, science is not written in stone. It's going to change as the evidence changes.
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, what's a good example? I mean, let's just use tools how to treat cancer. I mean, thank goodness science changes, right? Because imagine it was just set in stone. Oh, you get cancer, you're definitely going to die, right? But there's ways of treating cancer or people living longer with cancer or delaying it or taking out a good chunk of it. And I mean, I'm happy that science doesn't stick and is not, set in stone. Forget it. I think humanity would be doomed. I think humanity would have been extinct by now. If every science was set in stone. Yeah, no, but you're right about that. And and that's why I went with. So, okay, I don't know. Maybe a lot of people don't know. I'm just gonna try to follow it. And then I got a bit skeptical about some of the things. I was pro-vaccine though. That part I says, okay, so the vaccine comes, and then I'll be a little more, But some people are still anti-vaccine to this day. So I'm happy I never took it. You're an idiot for taking the vaccine. Things like that. Yeah, I just say, to each his own. Everyone has a unique story. I'm not gonna. If you're pro-vaccine, anti-vaccine. Look, just don't start arguing with me because I'll just keep going. We have a discussion. I'm open to discussion, but if you're gonna insult name calling, I'm from New York. We're good at that. So we're not pushovers when it comes to that. But get to be more grounded. Yeah, I mean the media. yeah, it's sadly it could spread, but this gets the main point. The media could spread so much hate, especially social media. That's on steroids, unfortunately. And critical thinking, and just like you said, not just in not just childhood. I think even parents have to be a team player on that too. Instead of just dumping their kids, let the school do everything for them. Sadly, that's very popular in America. Okay, the kid didn't learn in school, then it's school's fault. But the parents have to be involved. I know it's easier said than done, but parents got to be involved. It takes a village to raise a child. So that's all I'm going to say for that. And I was a very involved uncle on some of my nieces and nephews on education. So yeah, so I'm not a hypocrite when it comes to that statement. All right. So yeah, just make sure whatever you listen to, question it. It's okay to be skeptical. Or you gotta question things. You can't just fall for every single thing, because trust me, social media, especially social media, and sometimes the mainstream media pushes nonsensical articles or ideas. You gotta question it. Is it gonna be helpful to your life? Or is this causing division? And if so, why? If not, you gotta evaluate it, because everybody's life is different. So that's all I'm going to say about that. And sadly, that's why anti-Semitism is on the rise, because so many ignorant people just absorb hate. They soak it like a sponge. And yeah, man, that needs to stop. We need to be responsible people. Now, I'm not talking about for those of you who are responsible, this is not for you. This is for you impressionable, gullible people who just take everything social media said as gold. Trust me, it's a lot more junk than gold. There are good content on social media, but they will have their facts. They will cite their sources. They have video proof. And it's clear and straight to the point. Okay. They cite their sources. And that's why you should pay attention to people like, I'm going to shout out two doctors. Dr. Tim Tutan, I mispronounced his name. He's a Filipino doctor. He's very smart. He gives you practical ways how to fight cancer. And that's good information. And he cites his sources. So he's not just speaking just because.
You have to check that the sources are right, are reasonable as well.
And that's another step, right? Check if the sources are good. It's like we give you how to spot good information. That's a step higher. That's a level higher. She's a professor, and she's worked at university, so you gotta listen to her on this. If you're not gonna listen to me, at least listen to her, okay? That's all I'm gonna say about that. Before you just get at my thoughts, tell me how to think. But maybe some of you think it's not very good. You gotta, if you're brave, you will question some thoughts you held in the past, okay? And sometimes it's a little scary because you're just thinking that way. We like to do things out of convenience. No. You gotta seek truth. And that means challenging our own egos, our own biases, okay? That's all I'm gonna say about that. Anything else you want to add about being critical of information? You provide some valuable points here.
No, I think we've said quite a lot about being critical and using information wisely. I think to remember that there's a responsibility with any information and data to use it responsibly.
Yep. So absolutely. So let's just talk about. I'm going to say just briefly about the Israeli-Hamas conflict. I mean, they know my opinion. The innocents are paying the most, both the Israeli, Palestinians, and then there's a third group that doesn't get mentioned because I'm a Christian, so I'm a little more sensitive. The Christian group, that's the most marginalized of the two main parties that has their innocent and their barbaric murderers. I'm just going to say it that way. For the Israel side, they have the IDF. And I'm even this is going to be a little controversial. I'm even going to put a good chunk of the blame on Benjamin Netanyahu as well, because he tried to do crazy things with the Supreme Court. And
it's another example of where you've got a lurch to the right and an increasingly totalitarian leader. He's been there 14 years. Before the appalling events of the 11th, you'd already got conflict within Israel where large numbers of people were objecting to Netanyahu. He was trying to overturn the judiciary, which is the slippery slope to losing democracy. And you can argue that the present situation, had they not been so oppressive to the Palestinians, it wouldn't have been a way in for Hamas, because the Israelis haven't really respected Palestinians. You've got infiltration, West Bank settlers and things like that, treating Palestinians appallingly. Now, at the moment, you're in a position where you've got this appalling artillery and bombing and devastation of a civilian population. Now, that is against the Geneva Convention and shouldn't be happening. And winter is coming, and if you have a lot of people in a very small space with no water, they're going to get an infection. It could probably be typhus or something like that. And then more are going to die. Anyway, they're starving. So a starving, disease-ridden population, survival is not good.
I'm already imagining the potential backlash of that statement. It's like, oh, maybe it's part of the left. Look at her defending the Palestinian. No. Just listen before you just, support your tribe or your quote-unquote sports team. This is not a sporting event. This is a tragic event that's happening. Sadly, I'm tired of people just treating it as, it's us versus them. Yeah, this is why a lot of these conflicts happen, because of us versus them mentality.
I don't think anyone disputes that Hamas is a terrorist organization.
Exactly.
Or that the events on the 11th were appalling. They're akin to when the Twin Towers were bombed. Hamas is an ISIS-like organization.
Yeah, and that's the funny thing. I'm not saying I'm defending a bit of left here, and I'm mostly centrist. I'm not hearing a lot. I'm not hearing maybe the super, very, very few of them, but they're wacky and they get easily ignored, which is good. I think that's the best way to drown out bad ideas. Ignore them. Easier said than done with social media, because social media puts in your face, and a lot of people don't know how to combat misinformation, just like we have briefly went through. If you want to repeat, you're going to have to rewind it. Just rewind this part of the episode just to hear that again, because sometimes you need to drill it through your head. And I'm trying to be nice here because I already have 50 insults prepared for it. So yeah, no one's debating that. And I just think just sometimes, not all the time, I just think sometimes they just start off with that premise. Look, Hamas is a terrorist organization. I've said that before too, and I said they need to just be done and wiped out. And then add to your point there, which it could be both. Israel needs to treat Palestinians with more respect and help them, build, because they live in horrible conditions compared to Israel. It's night and day difference about how they live. And Palestinian people, the only thing I'm going to say to you is, if you can, just pick a more sensible, responsible government. I know there's the PLO, which is the more responsible Palestinian form of government that try to work with Israel. And Israel work 10 times as hard, try to work with that government, okay? They're the reasonable, good Palestinian government. And that's the thing with Palestinians. They have two separate governments. The radical ones, which you already talk about, is Hamas. And they're the ones that conduct a lot of violence. So, and no one's debating that. So stop saying, oh, this person's defending Hamas. I don't want to hear that, because I'm not hearing that at all. And I'm having a conversation with her. That's when it gets ridiculous. And sadly, a lot of people in America don't know how to have a conversation about this, because they just jump at, oh, Israel got a right to defend itself. I said, well, we're not saying that. But
Israel does have a right to defend itself, but it has to stay within international law. Right. And at the moment, it isn't.
No, it really isn't. It really isn't. I've been paying attention to this. I've not just watched, the American news is such a joke. I've been paying attention to international news sources, BBC to a lesser extent. And I think I like this Indian woman journalist, Palki Sharma. She's really, really good how she covers it. She covers it probably the most objective, analytical way. And she carefully crafts her story as compelling, informative, and intelligent. Check out First Post. She doesn't know me. I'm not getting paid for this, but they have a very responsible coverage on this particular issue. Certain things I would disagree with her were her analysis of American politics to some extent. But when it comes to the geopolitics, I would say 90% what she says. I'll take it to an account and check my sources Just because you like your journalists, you still got to check your sources that they're reporting from. I know it's easy to say, "Oh, I like her; she's telling the truth," or I could just pretend that Vivien's a reporter. I'm like, "Oh, I don't like her. I don't trust her. I'm gonna triple check, quadruple check if she's telling the truth." Don't go based on who you like. Pursue truth, because sometimes the person you like can be unintentionally or intentionally spreading misinformation. Sometimes you don't get the right facts when you first report. And that's, journalists have made that mistake before. It's not new. It happens. And we're humans, so we're prone to error. Okay? That's all I'm going to say about that. And I do check my sources, even when she reports. And I got to say, so far, for the most part, lines with the truth, especially with that conflict. I can't speak about other events because I haven't dig deep as much. So I'm just going to keep my mouth shut before I spread misinformation from my end. So I think we really went through a lot. And this could probably be a very long episode, but I don't mind it. It was worth it. It was jam-packed with gold bullion and nuggets. And before I finish this, is anything else you want to add in general?
Well, yes, you can buy my book. It's Kino and Kinder, and you can get it from Amazon or any online bookseller, or your local bookshop should be able to get it in for you. It's available on Kindle, and it looks like this, Kino and Kinder. And I'm Vivien Sieber, Sieber. It's got a Facebook group, so I do use social media. And if you just do Facebook, Kino and Kinder, you'll come up with the group. And yeah, I've got a website, Vivien Sieber, all one word, Vivien Sieber.eu. And there's more about the book on that, with some of the pictures.
For the audio listeners, you might just put that book cover again, so I give a little bit of strict description just for our audio listeners. Yeah, so I have a nice lady in the top right corner.
It's my grandmother, Paula.
Yep, the grandpa, and the bottom is your father, right?
Dad.
The British military. Yep. Okay.
And then the one next to him is a picture of the girls, the Kinder, when they first, actually quite early on in Tynemouth. And then the other picture is just a cinema ticket from the Palace Kino for balance.
Yep. Yeah, so it's has a lot of colors. The title has a yellow background to it, more like a goldenrod, darkish kind of yellow to it. It's not a bright yellow. And the biggest words, Kino and Kinder, it's white. So once you click on it, you'll see what it looks like. It's a very nice cover to it. And it's multi-layered, just like that book is, because it's not focused on one thing. So that's why it needs multiple images. And me, I try to be ambitious here, but all I got is one. I'm not even sure I got even anything right, but this is sadly the best I could come up with this background. So don't take my background very seriously. I think my background will give misinformation here. There you go. A little label, misinformation with my background. Don't take my background very seriously. It's just trying to relate to the whole owning a prestigious cinema in Vienna until Hitler took over, and of course censored it with anything Jewish in there. So I mean, this just gives you at best a tip of the iceberg if I'm going to be nice to my background. So, well, and the audio people, you don't need to know. If you're curious enough, you can jump to the video version and bash me for having such a bad background. I'm fine with that. I'm a grown person. I have thick skin. You're just paying attention to the wrong stuff. That's what I can say about that. So get that book. It's very, very important for you to get that book and join the Facebook group. Just try to have an online community with that with the book, and I'm sure other things that are related to that book. And this is a good time to refresh your historical understanding, because if we don't study history, know the past, we are doomed to repeat it. So the book is trying to do exactly that through her family tree. And that's an easy intersection with biology and history, the family tree. I mean, it makes perfect sense. Should have said that one earlier. I said maybe it's the family tree thing that connects history and biology together. Yep. So it makes perfect sense for her just transfer skills to learn about our past with them. You know, transferable skills are important. I know it's like a career planner or a career counselor. Transferable skills are very important. They can be used in more than one way if you apply correctly. So, you know, Vivien, it was great having you. You provide a lot of insight and a compelling story for sure. That's why I let you speak nearly uninterrupted, because I just think it was just very good just to do that, because normally I would just chime in if I really see something, but I think it was so good and so packed that I think it needs to be told just like that. I think my interruption would have diluted the story. That's why I personally think.
But thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about my story.
No, and for anyone who is even Muslim, Palestinian background, you're welcome to be on my show as well. I want your perspective to be expressed as well, because this is not a pro-Zionist kind of platform. I want as much perspectives as possible. I just, you know, I don't care if you're a Democrat, Republican, Independent, Green Party, Libertarian, or someone who's in between, or someone who's not represented. I think it'll be interesting, because these stories need to be told more often, and you know, I think it's great value. So hope you hit that like button, comment on what was great or what was bad. Don't worry, I'm not going to be like the totalitarian state, just censor the bad opinions, make myself look perfect. Not going to do that. I'll leave it in there for the sake of the First Amendment, even though, you know, my emotions might be bruised a few times. But as a pro 1A person, we need the good opinion and the ugly opinion. If it gets taken down, you can blame YouTube. That's YouTube's fault. I'm not going to do that. Let YouTube do that. They're flawed in some of their ways. But if it gets taken down on YouTube, Rumble, you don't need to worry about that. So far, it's mostly a free platform. And then Acast, I think Acast is pretty free about it as well. It's YouTube's the one that I won't be surprised if you say something, but if you say something very nasty, you know, if you're just saying derogatory things, that's a different story. But if you're just being critical in a constructive way, of course, that's allowed. You know, that's the best way I could clear that up without getting too elongated here. So, all right. So sadly, me and her got other things to do. We're grown, responsible people. You know, she's all the way in Europe, and I like that I get to talk to people from different countries. That's why I love this podcast, because I already covered America very extensively, and get to at least broaden my horizons when it comes to other countries. So, like I said, anyone around the world, you're welcome to be here. Just register through Podmatch. If you email me directly about being a guest, I will ignore you because I'm going to think you're spam. And I try contacting those people that end up being spam. So go to Podmatch. That's why I'm being strict here. Go to Podmatch if you want to be a guest. And it has nothing to do with promoting on Podmatch. Once I find an alternative platform, I will promote that as well for guests to be in other podcasting video platforms. All right. So, all right. This is when I went through this long enough. So for wherever you're listening to, you have a blessed day, afternoon, or night.